They called her a homeless drifter and a liability. They had no idea the woman in baggy scrubs was a war hero. When the Black Hawk landed, the elite doctors panicked. But Renata recognized the sound of a mission gone wrong. The miracle surgeon froze as the commander flatlined. He saw a corpse, she saw a soldier who refused to die. She shoved the doctors aside and plunged her hand into the wound, holding a hero's life together with her bare fist. The doctors mocked her, until the 4-star general stood at attention and gave the nurse the ultimate salute. The arrogant were humbled and the invisible became the leader. In this hospital, respect is finally the only currency. The St. Gabriel Trauma Center did not look like a hospital, it looked like a cathedral of glass and steel, a monument to the miracles of modern medicine and the staggering wealth of its patrons. To the public, it was a sanctuary. But to those who worked within its sterile, whitewashed walls, it was a battlefield of egos. At the top of the food chain were the intouchables, a select circle of surgeons and specialists who moved through the halls like deities. They didn't just save lives, they curated their reputations. In this world, the quality of your watch mattered as much as the precision of your scalpel, and the image of the hospital was guarded more fiercely than the patients themselves. That was why, when Renata Montero first appeared at the staff entrance, she was treated not as a colleague, but as a contaminant. She arrived on a rainy Tuesday, her slight frame nearly swallowed by a faded, oversized raincoat. Her hair was pulled back into a bun so tight it looked painful, and her eyes carried a weary, hollow depth, the look of someone who had seen the end of the world and somehow survived it. She didn't carry a designer bag or a sleek laptop. She carried a single, battered duffel bag in a quietness that felt heavy, almost suffocating. To the security guard at the front desk, she looked like one of the many broken souls who wandered the city's back alleys. "Deliveries are in the rear, lady," the guard snapped, not even looking up from his monitor. Renata didn't flinch. She simply reached into her pocket and produced a crumpled orientation letter. "I'm the new nursing transfer for the trauma ward," she said. Her voice was a low, gravelly rasp, like stones grinding together. The guard squinted at the paper, then at her. He laughed, a short, mocking sound. "You? A trauma nurse? You look like you need a bed, not a job. Check-in is at the basement level. Don't use the main elevators, they're for VIPs and doctors only." Renata took her paper back, her expression unchanging, and headed for the stairs. She didn't tell him that she had spent 20 years in places where elevators were a luxury and floors were made of dirt. By the time she reached the fourth wing, the rumors had already begun to circulate. In the plush staff lounge, where the air smelled of expensive espresso and sterilized perfection, Dr. Gustavo Noguera was holding court. Gustavo was the poster boy for St. Gabriel. With over 1 million followers on social media, he was known as the miracle surgeon. He was young, impossibly handsome, and possessed a cruelty that was as sharp as his surgical tools. He thrived on the hierarchy. To Gustavo, people were divided into 2 categories, those who could advance his career and those who were invisible. "I heard the new hire is a charity case," Gustavo chuckled, leaning back in his leather chair. He adjusted the cuff of his silk shirt, making sure his Rolex caught the light. "The chief of medicine is trying to diversify the staff by bringing in people from unconventional backgrounds. Apparently, she's some middle-aged drifter who managed to scrape a nursing license together." "Fernanda, have you seen her yet?" Nurse Fernanda, the head of the surgical prep team and Gustavo's most loyal sycophant, sneered as she poured him a cup of coffee. "I saw her in the hall. She's wearing scrubs that look like they were salvaged from a dumpster. And her hands. Gustavo, they shake. I watched her trying to pick up a fallen pen. It took her 3 tries. How are we supposed to trust someone like that in a high-pressure environment? She's a disaster waiting to happen." The laughter that followed was sharp and exclusionary. It was the kind of laughter designed to remind everyone in the room who belonged and who didn't. They began to call her the ghost or the janitor nurse. They assumed she was there because she had nowhere else to go. They saw her oversized clothes and assumed she was hiding a frail, weak body. They saw her silence and assumed she was slow-witted. What they couldn't see were the scars that ran like jagged maps across her shoulders, souvenirs from a decade spent as a first lieutenant in the Paracar, the elite rescue unit of the Air Force. They didn't know that her hands trembled not from weakness, but from the neurological echoes of a blast that had leveled a convoy and nearly taken her life. They didn't know that Renata Montero had performed more surgeries under fire than Gustavo had performed in his climate-controlled operating room. Renata's first 3 weeks were a masterclass in humiliation. The doctors went out of their way to assign her the most degrading tasks. While the younger, prettier nurses were invited into the OR to observe, Renata was sent to scrub the floors of the decontamination rooms. While the residents discussed complex cases, Renata was ordered to empty bedpans and change soiled linens in the long-term care ward. She became the hospital's punching bag. One afternoon, the tension reached a breaking point. Caio Rangel, a second-year resident with a fragile ego and a desperate need for Gustavo's approval, decided to make an example of her. He was standing in the busy nurses' station, surrounded by staff, when he intentionally knocked a tray of used medical waste onto the floor near Renata's feet. "Oops," Caio said, a smirk playing on his face. "Looks like a mess, newbie. Since you're so used to being in the dirt, why don't you get down there and clean that up? And make it quick. I have a surgery in 10 minutes, and I need my boots polished. You look like you've had practice with that." The station went silent. Everyone watched, waiting for the homeless nurse to break, to cry, or to apologize. Renata looked down at the mess, then up at Caio. For the first time, she truly looked at him. Her eyes, usually dull and distant, suddenly sharpened into 2 points of cold, lethal steel. It was a look of such absolute, predatory focus that Caio felt his breath hitch in his throat. It wasn't the look of a victim, it was the look of a commander assessing a target. "You have a surgery in 10 minutes, Renata said softly. Her voice hadn't changed, but it carried a weight that seemed to vibrate in the air. "And yet, you are standing here, wasting time and creating a biohazard. If I were your commanding officer, I would have you stripped of your rank for such incompetence. But since I am just the janitor, I will clean this up." She knelt down, her movements fluid and precise, despite the slight tremor in her hands. She cleaned the spill with a terrifying efficiency, never once taking her eyes off Caio. "Stay out of my way, old woman," Caio stammered, trying to regain his bravado as he backed away. "You don't belong here. You're a mistake that HR hasn't fixed yet." As he turned to leave, he didn't see the way Renata's hands tightened around the cleaning cloth. He didn't see the way she breathed, slow, deep, and rhythmic, the tactical breath used by soldiers to suppress adrenaline. Renata knew that a storm was coming. She could feel it in the air, a certain pressure that always preceded a catastrophe. She had spent her life in the path of storms, and she knew that when the world finally broke, it wouldn't be the men in silk shirts or the doctors with millions of followers who would stand their ground. It would be the ones who had already been through the fire. That evening, as the sun dipped below the horizon and the luxury cars of the elite surgeons lined the valet stand, a heavy, dark cloud began to roll over the city. And far away, in the secret corridors of power, a phone call was being made. A high-value mission had gone wrong. A hero was falling. And the only person who could save him was currently being mocked for the way she held a coffee cup. The countdown had begun, and the untouchables of St. Gabriel had no idea that their world was about to collide with a reality they weren't prepared to handle. The atmosphere inside St. Gabriel changed before the first siren was even heard. A heavy, unnatural pressure settled over the trauma ward, the kind of stillness that precedes a devastating storm. Renata felt it in her marrow. While Dr. Gustavo was busy recording a day in the life video for his social media, preening in front of a mirror, Renata was standing by the window of the supply closet. Her eyes were fixed on the gray horizon. Then, it started, a low-frequency vibration that rattled the surgical trays. It wasn't the light, rhythmic pulse of a civilian life flight. It was a deep, bone-shaking thump-thump-thump that echoed through the concrete. It was the sound of a Black Hawk helicopter, a machine designed for war, screaming toward a place of peace. For the first time in weeks, Renata's hands stopped trembling. The phantom noise that usually haunted her sleep was now a physical reality. Her training, dormant but lethal, surged to the surface. She didn't see the hospital walls anymore, she saw a landing zone. Code Black. All hands to Trauma 1. The intercom shrieked, its mechanical voice cracking with urgency. Multiple gunshot wounds, high-value asset incoming. Clear the bay. The hospital exploded into chaos. Gustavo, startled by the alarm, nearly dropped his phone. Finally, he muttered, adjusting his scrub cap to look heroic. A real case. Fernanda, get the team ready. I want the best lighting in there. This is going to be a career maker. The trauma bay doors were kicked open with a violence that sent a shockwave through the room. For men in tactical gear, their faces streaked with grime and sweat, rushed in alongside the paramedics. They weren't just guards, they were a protective shield around the gurney. On that gurney lay a man who looked like he had been pulled from a furnace. Commander Marcos, the breaker Azevedo, was a mass of shredded tactical fabric and deep, arterial red. His chest was riddled with holes, and his face was a mask of pale, gray shock. He's flatlining. We lost him twice on the bird, the lead operator shouted. He was a mountain of a man with a scar running down his jaw. He grabbed Gustavo by the shoulder, his grip tight enough to bruise. You're the hotshot. Fix him. If his heart stops, yours might too. Gustavo, momentarily terrified by the raw aggression of the soldier, stammered, I'm the best there is. Move aside. But as Gustavo looked at the carnage on the table, his star persona began to crack. There was too much blood. The wounds were jagged, caused by high-velocity rounds that tumble through flesh. Gustavo began barking orders for a chest tube, his voice rising an octave in panic. He was focused on the visible wounds on the commander's torso, frantically stitching and suctioning. Why isn't the pressure coming up? Gustavo screamed. I've plugged the holes. Why is he still empty? In the corner, hidden behind the crash cart, Renata watched. She saw what Gustavo's ego wouldn't let him see. She looked at the commander's right leg, which was slightly rotated, and the way his abdomen was beginning to swell like a dark, bruised balloon. Junctional hemorrhage, she thought. The bullet hadn't just hit his chest, a fragment had severed the femoral artery right where it met the pelvis, death zone where a normal tourniquet couldn't reach. The leg, Renata said. Her voice was low, but it cut through the screaming and the beeping of the monitors like a razor. You're missing the femoral. He's bleeding out into his gut. Gustavo didn't even look at her. Shut up, you crazy old woman. Security, get this janitor out of my sight. She's contaminating the room. Caio, the resident, moved to shove Renata back, but she didn't budge. She was a statue of iron. He has 60 seconds of life left, Renata said, her eyes now locked on the commander's fading pulse on the monitor. You can fire me later. But if you don't stop the internal leak in the groin, you're just a man standing over a corpse. The lead soldier looked from the panicked, sweating Gustavo to the calm, cold-eyed nurse in the oversized scrubs. He saw something in Renata he recognized, the 1,000-yard stare of a veteran. Let her through, the soldier growled, raising a hand to stop Caio. I am the lead surgeon. Gustavo shrieked, his face turning a frantic shade of red. I order you to. Renata didn't wait for permission. She stepped into the light of the trauma bay. With a swift, practiced motion, she grabbed a pair of trauma shears and sliced open the commander's tactical pants. A fountain of dark blood erupted, splashing across her face and the floor. The room gasped. Gustavo froze, paralyzed by the sheer volume of the bleed. He's gone. Fernanda cried, pointing at the flat line on the monitor. He's dead. Not on my watch, Renata whispered. Without a moment's hesitation, she didn't reach for a tool. She balled her fist, leaned her entire body weight forward, and plunged her hand deep into the open, bloody wound in the commander's groin. She was using her own body as a human clamp, pinning the shredded artery against the bone. The silence that followed was deafening. The only sound was the heavy breathing of the soldiers and the drip of blood hitting the floor. Then, a miracle happened. A single, weak beep echoed from the monitor. Then another. The flat line began to jump. Pressure is returning, the lead soldier whispered, his eyes wide. Renata looked up at Gustavo, who stood with his hands hovering uselessly in the air. Get the vascular tray, doctor, she commanded, her voice vibrating with an authority that made everyone in the room instinctively stand straighter. Or are you just going to stand there and watch me do your job? The ghost of Saint Gabriel had returned to the battlefield, and the Intouchables were about to realize that their kingdom was built on sand. The trauma bay, once a theater for Dr. Gustavo's vanity, had transformed into a cold, metallic pressure cooker. Renata remained anchored to the gurney, her arm buried elbow deep in the commander's groin. Her face, usually obscured by the oversized surgical mask, was now a portrait of absolute, terrifying focus. The tremors that had plagued her hands for weeks, the weakness the staff had mocked, had vanished. In the presence of a dying soldier, her nervous system had reverted to its factory settings, ice-cold, tactical precision. Outside the trauma bay, the general's transport had just entered the hospital airspace. The real reveal was minutes away, and Gustavo was about to find out that the woman he called a janitor was the only reason his hospital was still standing. The surgery had concluded, but the atmosphere in the intensive care wing remained thick with the scent of antiseptic and the heavy, lingering metallic tang of blood. Dr. Gustavo Noguera stood in the center of the hallway, the center of a frantic circle of nurses and administrators. He had already discarded his blood-stained outer gown for a pristine, white designer lab coat. He was busy wiping his brow with a silk handkerchief, his ego inflating with every passing second. It was a touch-and-go situation, he told the hospital's PR director, his voice projecting loudly enough to ensure every passerby heard him. I had to perform a highly complex, improvised vascular repair under extreme duress. That nurse, Montero, she nearly compromised the sterile field with her erratic, unprofessional behavior. I'll be filing a report. If I hadn't stepped in to correct her pressure, the commander would be dead. Renata sat on a cold, orange plastic chair near the end of the hall, tucked away by a vending machine. She hadn't changed her scrubs, they were still damp with the commander's lifeblood. She looked small, exhausted, and entirely invisible. Her hands had returned to their rhythmic, subtle tremor, the neurological ghost of the blast that had ended her military career. To the socialites and elite doctors walking past, she looked like a broken woman, low-status worker who had finally cracked under the pressure of a real emergency. Fernanda, Gustavo's head nurse, walked by and tossed a stack of used towels toward Renata's lap. Don't just sit there looking traumatized, Fernanda hissed. Clean yourself up and get these to the laundry. You're lucky the doctor isn't calling the police for what you did in there. Renata didn't respond. She simply stared at the floor, her mind miles away in a dusty valley where she had once held a different man's life together. But the silence of the hospital was about to be shattered. The automatic doors of the main lobby hissed open with a sound like a guillotine blade falling. The casual chatter of the staff died instantly. The rhythm of the building changed. It was the sound of boots, heavy, synchronized, and authoritative. A squad of military police in dress blues marched in, forming a corridor of steel. Behind them walked General Elias Vance. He was a man made of granite and metals, a four-star legend whose presence seemed to suck the oxygen out of the room. He didn't look at the architecture or the expensive art on the walls. His eyes were like radar, scanning for a target. Gustavo straightened his posture, flashing his most practiced, miracle worker, smile. He stepped into the center of the hallway, blocking the general's path. General Vance. An honor, sir. I am Dr. Gustavo Noguera, the Chief of Trauma and the lead surgeon on Commander Azevedo's case. I'm happy to report that despite some internal interference, I managed to save him. If you'll follow me to my office, I can brief you on the... The general didn't stop. He didn't even slow down. He walked directly through Gustavo's personal space, his shoulder clipping the surgeon's arm with enough force to send him stumbling backward into a trash receptacle. The Star of St. Gabriel let out a small, undignified yelp as his expensive gold watch caught on the metal rim of the bin. The general didn't even look back. General Vance stopped in front of the vending machine. He looked down at the woman in the oversized, blood-caked scrubs. The hospital staff held their collective breath, many expecting him to bark at the cleaner for being in his way. Instead, the general did something that shattered the reality of everyone watching. He clicked his heels together, stood at a rigid, perfect attention, and brought his hand to his brow in a slow, reverent, and deeply respectful salute. Lieutenant Montero, the general's voice boomed, echoing off the glass walls. The ghost of Pericar. We've been searching for you since you walked out of the VA 3 years ago. The commander told me months ago, if I ever take a hit, find Renata. She's the only one who can knit a soul back into a body. I see you haven't lost your edge. Renata stood up slowly. Her spine, which had been slumped in feigned humility, snapped into a line of pure steel. She didn't look like a nurse anymore. She looked like a titan. She returned the salute with a precision that made the MPs look like amateurs. Just holding the line, sir, she said, her voice no longer a rasp, but a command. He's still crashing. Fernanda shrieked, her eyes darting to the monitor. The heart rate was a frantic, irregular rhythm. The chest tube isn't draining enough. We're losing the airway. Gustavo stood frozen. His expensive silk scrubs were splattered with blood, and his surgical mask was damp with the sweat of a man who realized he was out of his depth. He had performed hundreds of elective surgeries and managed routine traumas, but he had never seen a body so systematically destroyed by war. I need to open the chest, Gustavo stammered, his voice losing its melodic, confident edge. A thoracotomy. We have to find the internal bleed. If you crack that chest now, his blood pressure will drop to 0 and he'll be dead before you touch the lung, Renata's voice cut through his panic. It wasn't a suggestion, it was a tactical report. The chest wounds are secondary. He's in hypovolemic shock because of the junctional bleed I'm holding. You need to ligate the femoral and then address the tension pneumothorax with a needle, not a scalpel. Do it now, doctor, or step aside. The room held its breath. A nurse, a janitor, in their eyes, was dictating terms to the chief of trauma. Caio, recovering from being shoved, tried to intervene. You're overstepping, Montero. You're a nurse, not a surgeon. Get your hands out of there and let the doctor work. Stay back, kid, the bearded operator growled, stepping between Caio and the gurney. He didn't look at the resident, his eyes were fixed on Renata. He recognized the way she stood, the weight distribution, the calm breathing. He had seen it in the field medics of the Pericar. She stays. You help her, or you leave. Gustavo, realizing the soldiers were the ones truly in charge, moved with trembling hands. He reached for the vascular tray. Give me a 3-0 proline, he ordered, trying to reclaim some shred of authority. But as he leaned in to stitch the artery Renata was holding, his hands failed him. The sight of the shredded vessel, pulsing weakly against Renata's fingers, caused his vision to tunnel. He fumbled the needle driver, the metal tool clattering against the commander's pelvic bone. Your hands are shaking, doctor, Renata said, her voice dangerously quiet. Is the Star of St. Gabriel afraid of a little blood? It's a complex repair. Gustavo snapped, his face flushed. I can't see past your hand. Then use your touch. Stop looking for the camera and start looking for the life, she countered. She adjusted her grip slightly, her knuckles white with the effort of holding back the tide of death. For a split second, the commander's eyes fluttered open. They were glassy, unfocused, and filled with a primal terror. He looked directly at Renata. Renata. The commander wheezed, a bubble of crimson foam forming on his lips. The extraction, did they get out? Everyone's out, Commander, she lied, her voice softening into a maternal warmth that was even more jarring than her previous coldness. You're home. You're at St. Gabriel. I'm holding you. You don't go anywhere until I say so. That's an order. The commander's body went limp as he lost consciousness again, but the monitor stayed steady. Renata had called him back from the edge. With a sigh of frustration, she looked at the struggling Gustavo. Move. I'll guide the clamp. You just lock it. With Renata's blood-soaked fingers acting as a guide, Gustavo finally managed to place the vascular clamp. As the metal teeth clicked shut, the fountain of blood finally ceased. The pressure on the monitor began to climb, slowly, painfully, but surely. Renata slowly withdrew her hand, her arm stained red up to the elbow. She didn't look for a towel, she didn't look for applause. She immediately turned her attention to the monitor. He's stabilized for transport to the main ore, Renata announced to the room. She looked at the lead operator. He needs a level 1 infuser and 4 units of O- on the move. Don't let these doctors stop for a photo op in the hallway. As the team began to move the gurney toward the elevators, Gustavo tried to wipe the blood from his face, looking for a way to spin the narrative. Good assist, Montero, he said, his voice regaining its arrogance now that the immediate danger had passed. I'll mention your initiative in the post-op report. But don't think this changes your status. You still broke protocol. You're still a liability. Renata didn't even look at him. She walked to the sink and began to scrub the commander's blood from her skin. The water ran bright red. She watched her hands in the mirror. They were steady as stone. She knew the fight wasn't over. The commander was alive, but the vultures of St. Gabriel were already preparing to claim the kill. The silence that followed was absolute. Gustavo's face turned the color of sour milk. Fernanda's clipboard clattered to the floor, the pages scattering like fallen leaves. The homeless nurse they had mocked, the woman they had treated as a janitor, was a decorated war hero, a legend whose name was whispered in the highest corridors of power. The instant karma was palpable. The intouchables had just realized they were standing in the shadow of a giant. The silence that filled the corridor of St. Gabriel was not the peaceful quiet of a hospital at night, it was the suffocating, heavy silence of a courtroom before a verdict is read. General Vance's salute remained frozen in the air, a bridge of ironclad respect between the highest-ranking officer in the room and the woman the staff had spent a month trying to break. Dr. Gustavo Noguera was still leaning against the trash receptacle, his face pale and his breathing shallow. The miracle surgeon looked small, his designer lab coat suddenly appearing like a costume on an actor who had forgotten his lines. General, Gustavo finally stammered, his voice cracking like dry parchment. There must be some grave misunderstanding. This woman. Renata, she's a rotating nurse. A new hire. She has no specialized trauma certification on file. She's been doing basic maintenance. She is the reason the man in that ICU is still breathing, the general interrupted, his voice dropping to a dangerous, low rumble. He lowered his salute and stepped toward Gustavo, the clicking of his boots sounding like a drumbeat of doom. And she is a first lieutenant of the Pericar, a recipient of the Silver Star, and the woman who pioneered the very junctional hemorrhage protocols you were supposed to be following in that trauma bay. If she hadn't interfered, doctor, you would be filling out a death certificate for the most decorated commander in the Special Forces. You didn't save him. You were an obstacle she had to overcome to save him. The hospital staff gasped. Fernanda, who had spent weeks calling Renata the mute, felt the floor beneath her sway. The shaking hands they had laughed at weren't the signs of a drifter's withdrawal, they were the scars of a hero who had shielded a wounded soldier from a blast with her own body. The oversized scrubs weren't a lack of fashion, they were the armor of a woman who had nothing left to prove to anyone who cared about appearances. At that moment, the chief of medicine, Dr. Eris, hurried down the hall, flanked by the hospital's legal counsel. He had seen the security footage. He had seen the general's arrival. He looked at Gustavo, then at Renata, and his expression was one of profound regret. "Lieutenant Montero," Dr. Eris began, bowing his head slightly. "I apologize. When you applied to work here, you requested anonymity. You asked to be treated as any other staff member, to work in the shadows and find peace. We honored that request, but it seems our environment has failed you. It seems our star culture has blinded us to true excellence." Renata finally spoke. She stood tall, her eyes sweeping over the crowd of doctors and nurses who had mocked her. "I didn't come here for an apology, Dr. Eris," she said, her voice echoing with the clarity of a bugle call. "I came here because I thought this was a place of healing. But healing cannot happen where there is arrogance. It cannot happen where a nurse's worth is measured by the brand of her shoes rather than the steadiness of her heart. You have a cancer in this hospital, and it's not in the patients. It's in the staff." She turned her gaze to Caio, who was trembling in the corner, and then to Fernanda. "You called me a cleaner," Renata said softly. "You were right. I am a cleaner. And today, I'm going to start cleaning this ward." General Vance smiled, a cold, sharp expression. "The military's contract with this trauma center is the only thing keeping your research wing funded, Dr. Eris," the general noted. "And my contract is with the best. I don't see the best in Dr. Noguera. I see a man who prioritizes a camera over a heartbeat." Dr. Eris nodded slowly, the weight of the decision visible on his shoulders. He turned to Gustavo. "Dr. Noguera, you are suspended effective immediately. An internal review will be launched into your conduct during the commander's surgery, and your history of workplace harassment will be handed over to the board. Your star has set." Gustavo tried to speak, but no words came out. He was escorted away by two of the general's MPs, his untouchable status vanishing like smoke in a gale. "As for you, Lieutenant," Dr. Eris continued, looking at Renata with genuine hope. "We are in desperate need of a director of trauma operations. Someone who understands that every second counts and every person, from the janitor to the surgeon, deserves respect. The position is yours, if you'll have it. You can wear whatever scrubs you like." Renata looked at the general, then toward the ICU where the commander lay. A small, sad smile touched her lips. "I'll take the job," she said. "But on one condition. We start by teaching the residents how to hold a mop. If they can't respect the floor they walk on, they'll never respect the patients they treat." The instant karma was complete. The invisible shadow was now the light of the hospital, and the stars were left in the dark. Part 6, The Commander's Salute and the Peace of the Ghost. A week had passed since the night the sky over St. Gabriel was filled with the thunder of Black Hawks and the shattered ego of its most famous surgeon. The hospital had undergone a transformation that no board of directors could have authorized with a memo. It was a change of soul. The untouchables were gone, replaced by a culture of quiet, focused urgency. In the hallways where Dr. Gustavo used to film his self-congratulatory videos, there was now a sign that read, "Status is a privilege, service is a duty." Renata Montero, now the director of trauma operations, stood in the doorway of the intensive care unit. She was no longer wearing the oversized, stained blue scrubs. She wore a tailored set of charcoal gray surgical gear with her name, Director R. Montero, embroidered in silver. Her hair was still pulled back in that severe, practical bun, but her eyes no longer looked hollow. The ghost had come home. Inside the room, Commander Marcos, the breaker Azevedo, was finally awake. He was propped up against the pillows, tubes still snaking from his chest, but his color had returned. He was no longer a mess of shredded tissue, he was a man reclaimed from the edge of the abyss. When he saw Renata, a slow, pained smile spread across his face. He didn't see a director. He saw the woman who had reached into the darkness and pulled him back by the throat. "I remember your hands," the commander whispered, his voice still a rasping shadow of its former self. "I remember the cold of the floor, and then the heat of your hand. You didn't just stop the bleeding, Renata. You gave me your strength." Renata walked to his bedside and checked the monitors. Her hands didn't tremble. Not even a fraction. "You were always a stubborn man, Marcos," she said softly. "I just reminded your heart that it wasn't finished yet. The general says you'll be back on your feet in a month." I told him he was being optimistic. "I give you 3 weeks." The commander laughed, then winced as the stitches in his groin tugged. "I heard what happened. I heard about the star who tried to play God. The general told me you're running this place now. It's about time a real soldier took the bridge." Renata looked out the window. Down in the courtyard, she saw a group of first-year residents, including a very humbled Caio Rangel. They weren't in the operating room, they were in the ambulance bay, learning how to properly sanitize a gurney and restock a trauma kit. They were doing the work they once thought was beneath them. Under Renata's new rules, no doctor could pick up a scalpel until they had spent a week in the dirt, learning the value of every link in the chain of survival. "It's not about running it like a military base, Marcos," Renata said, turning back to him. "It's about making sure that the next time someone like you comes through those doors, they aren't met by an ego. They're met by a team. I spent 20 years saving people in places that didn't have names. I won't let a man die here because someone was worried about their social media following." Just then, the door opened, and Dr. Eris entered, followed by General Vance. The general was in his full dress uniform, his chest a tapestry of history and heroism. He stood at the foot of the bed and nodded to the commander, then turned to Renata. "Lieutenant. I mean, Director," the general said. "The Pentagon has officially requested that St. Gabriel become the primary training center for our civilian military medical exchange. They want your protocols implemented nationwide." Renata didn't glow with pride. She didn't offer a rehearsed speech. She simply nodded once, a gesture of mission accepted. "We start tomorrow at 5 o'clock, General. I expect the first batch of surgeons to be ready to work." As the general and Dr. Eris left to finalize the paperwork, the commander looked at Renata one last time. "You found it, didn't you? The noise you were looking for." Renata smiled, a real, genuine smile that reached her eyes. For the first time in years, the silence of civilian life didn't feel like a vacuum. It felt like peace. She had taken the shards of her broken life and used them to build a sanctuary for others. The doctors had laughed at the new nurse, but they were no longer laughing. They were listening. They were learning. And they were finally, truly, healing. The instant karma wasn't just in Gustavo's fall, it was in Renata's rise. She had proven that true power doesn't come from the status you claim, but from the respect you earn when the world is falling apart.